Leningrad, ein Eckpfeiler der Sowjets an der Nordfront, ist nun von allen Seiten eingeschlossen. Deutsche Kampfflugzeuge greifen die bolschewistischen Stellungen an.
Footage from a German newsreel, the Deutsche Wochenschau, 1941. The German offensive against Leningrad. The Wehrmacht troops possessed superior military equipment and kept approaching closer and closer to the city. On August the 21st, the German army was only 20 kilometers away from Leningrad. September 4th. 2.5 months after the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, German shells exploded in the streets of the city. Hitler considered the capture of Leningrad to be one of the major goals of the war. He specifically declared this on December 18, 1940, in Directive Number 21 of the Barbarossa Plan. First Leningrad must fall, then the attack on Moscow can begin. As Hitler was advised to let the German army bomb Leningrad in early September, he announced that the city would soon capitulate. German troops managed by the end of August to cut off the last remaining railway connection with the city. The German soldiers could already feel victory in the air. The city was so close. But Hitler suddenly ordered to stop the offensive. Instead, Hitler ordered a blockade around the city. The citizens of Leningrad should be cut off from communication with the outside world, and no food or other supplies were allowed to enter the city. No attempt to infiltrate the blockade was allowed. Millions of people trapped in the city were sentenced to a slow and brutal death by starvation.
In the beginning of the war, Leningrad was one of Hitler's primary targets. One can see this clearly from his own words. Only after Leningrad's capitulation would the German troops head to Moscow. Leningrad was strategically important, and everyone knew it. That's why the city had to be destroyed.
While visiting the Nord troops on June the 21st, 1940, shortly before the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler proclaimed Leningrad's conquer to be objective number 1. Moscow was, in comparison, of much lesser importance. In late August, Hitler again ignored the advice of the head office, who favoured targeting the main assault at Moscow. Instead, he proceeded with the attack on the Ukraine in the south and the relocation of tanks to the Leningrad front.
The Germans overran almost entire Europe while remaining on schedule. Only on the White Russian border did they run into difficulties. We kept them busy much longer than they had anticipated. As a result, Hitler transferred the center unit tanks to the Nord troops. Once Leningrad fell, they would then head to Moscow. The center unit commander demanded the tanks back from Hitler. He needed them to capture Moscow. But von Lieb needed those tanks for the offensive against Leningrad. And yet the city still would not surrender. The September days were devastating. The city awaited anxiously the deciding main assault. Everyone was given a job.
The enemy is very close, comrades. We may meet the enemy face to face. Therefore, comrades, let us take charge of our victory and work hard. Let us move toward our victory together with the Red Army, led by Lenin's party and Stalin. Let's move to our victory, comrades. German occupants must die.
One of the still unknown aspects of the Leningrad blockade is the perplexing relationship between the Leningrad Party organization and the advisors to the Kremlin in Smolny.
Stalin recognized that the resources which Leningrad possessed were not being optimally used on the front. In many conversations, he emphasized that Leningrad had new tanks and up-to-date weapons. Why then, asked Stalin, did they fail to conquer one city after another? Why were the Germans moving so quickly toward Leningrad? Stalin complained that the Leningrad authorities considered it unnecessary to inform him promptly on the current situation. He had to obtain information about Leningrad via alternative channels. So, when Leningrad's authorities established the City Defense Council in August 1941, it provoked a huge scandal. Stalin implicitly accused the political commissioners of abuse of power, saying, "You have no idea what you're doing," hinting that they should have planned how to get the city to surrender.
Говорит штаб местной противовоздушной обороны города. Воздушная тревога! Воздушная тревога!
I remember well the air raid of September 8th. The bombs blew up the Badaevsky food storages. I had watch duty on the roof. At first it was nice since the weather was so good. Suddenly the armada of German planes appeared, their wings flashing in the sun. In the next minute, the sky and the city were filled with smoke. Just incredible. Everybody can still remember that black smoke. But it was not coming from the food warehouses, but the oil refinery next door.
In this first massive air assault against Leningrad on September the 8th, 178 fires broke out in the city. The largest two were at the oil refining plant and the Badaevsky warehouses, where food supplies were kept.
The toll of destruction caused by the fires tormented the people of Leningrad. It was unclear for a long time just how much food had actually been destroyed in the warehouses. The most amazing rumors and accounts circulated. One view, which caused many supporters to blame the authorities, believed that if the food supplies had not been destroyed on September 8th, the city's residents would not have had to suffer the devastating starvation.
In fact, Badaevsky storages wouldn't have made a difference at all. This was a legend created by the world to explain what had caused the devastating starvation. They said there were 10 years' food supplies, but in reality, the food in those warehouses would have only been enough to supply the city for a day, or a maximum 2.
Enemy at the gates. On September 16th, this could be read on the cover of every Leningrad newspaper. The evening before, German troops had seized Uritsk, the next town closest to Leningrad. The Germans were only 10 kilometers away from the city center. German soldiers discovered a street tram full of people trying to flee to Leningrad. They stopped the tram and ordered everyone except for the driver to leave, saying, "In the morning we will march forward and this street tram we will take to Petersburg."
Meanwhile, since the end of August, the city's authorities were nervous and most likely in a state of panic. They were afraid to make any decisions regarding the transfer of troops or employing new tactical schemes. Then Stalin addressed Sadanov and Kuznetsov. How long do Leningrad's front commanders intend to continue their peasant passivity? If this continues, Leningrad will be conquered in the most shameful way.
Leningrad's situation was critical. On September 11th, Stalin appointed Zhukov the new commander-in-chief, dismissing Voroshilov. Zhukov took immediate control and commanded for drastic measures to save the city.
Zhukov targeted all the artillery we had at the most probable streets German tanks would take to enter the city. Even anti-aircraft artillery was ordered to make a wall of fire against the German tanks.
Von Lieb failed to conquer the city even with the extended time and the extra tanks he was allotted. Hitler ordered to deploy the tanks to Moscow. He realized that he couldn't occupy Leningrad with the first siege.
Then Zhukov changed the strategy to one of offense instead of defense.
From the diary of Nord Army General Field Marshal Commander von Leeb. Saturday, September 20th, 1941. With heavy enemy attacks today in the north, the enemy attempted to gain ground by the river Neva, so far its largest operation here. Obviously, they've focused all their forces into breaking through the circle around Leningrad. The Germans are well aware that should Leningrad fall and its military forces be defeated, the backbone of the resistance in the north will collapse. On September the 29th, Leeb wrote, "There is no evidence so far that their capability to attack has lessened."
In many publications about the defense of Leningrad, it's often discussed whether Stalin could have done more for the city. But I don't think that Stalin was reluctant or refused to help Leningrad. Stalin reminded authorities many times that Leningrad was more important than Vologda or Cherepovets. Leningrad was symbolic and was strategically important.
One may accuse Stalin of a lot, but not that he was suicidal. And the surrender of Leningrad would have been suicide for Stalin. First, the Baltic Navy would be annihilated. Second, it would have meant the shutdown of the second largest area of industry in the country. Leningrad produced 50% of the products used in the military. If the Germans had managed to occupy Leningrad, the Wehrmacht troops stationed by Leningrad would have then joined forces with the Finnish army and continued to march onward towards Moscow. At that time, there was neither the necessary equipment nor the human resources to launch a new offensive in the northwest to defend Moscow. Moscow would have fallen, and the outcome of the war would have been completely different.
By September 20th, the leaders of the Nord Army realized that their forces were insufficient to seize Leningrad. The troops were exhausted, and they were lacking soldiers and supplies. So the Nord Army changed its strategy. The German soldiers began to construct defensive lines, underground shelters, and dugouts. General Field Marshal von Leeb noted in his diary, September 21st, "I have visited the 18th Army's position. There are huge deficits in several divisions. General von Küchler has complained about the heavy artillery fire from the Russian ships, costing us about 100 soldiers daily." September 24th, "The army troops no longer have any reserves and have been forced into the defensive."
When the assault of the city in the south failed, the Germans decided to quickly join the efforts of the Finnish troops. They would move together around the lake of Ladozhskoye and then meet up with the Nord Battalion, creating a noose around Leningrad. There would have been no chance at all for us, but that never happened. In books, you can often read, "The Finnish troops reached the old state's border and Field Marshal Mannerheim ordered to stop the offensive." But there was no such order at that time. The order was first given on September 9th. Up until then, the Finns were actually still in motion toward Leningrad. Only then, after September 9th, 1941, did the troops stop moving towards Leningrad.
The Finnish commander Carl Gustav Mannerheim had completed his military studies in Leningrad and had even been one of the last Tsar's bodyguards. After the so-called Winter War with Russia, an alliance with Germany had been made. But it was not his affection for Leningrad that made him stop the offensive on September the 9th, 1941. He had other reasons.
First, the resistance of the Russian army against the Finnish troops en route to Leningrad was too strong. Second, more and more Finnish soldiers started deserting the front. They said, "We were told to join this war in order to regain the territories we lost in the Winter War. We're at the Sister River, our old border. Why should we move forward toward Leningrad?" Thirdly, the Finnish propaganda reported that the Germans were about to take Leningrad. But regardless of their attempts, they had failed to do so. Fourthly and lastly, the Finnish government received directives from the US and England demanding that the Finnish troops stop their invasion into territories of the Soviet Union. Churchill personally sent Mannerheim a letter requesting they stop their invasion. Mannerheim refused his request and continued moving south up to the Lake of Ladurskoy. And as a result, on December 6, 1941, England proclaimed war against Finland.
In August 1942, Stalin and Churchill met for a conference in Moscow. They discussed the possibility of launching a second front in southern Europe to provide some relief for the Red Army. At the end of the conference, Churchill asked about the situation in Leningrad's suburbs. "Everything is fine. Indeed, the Baltic Navy is also intact," Stalin replied with sarcasm. Stalin would never forget that a year earlier Churchill expressed concern that the Germans would occupy Leningrad and the Baltic Navy ships would be taken by the Wehrmacht and later targeted at England. Churchill insisted that the ships be destroyed and England would reimburse for the losses. Stalin refused, but he still took precautions.
Nikolai Kuznetsov, the naval commissioner, wrote that Stalin in September 1941 sent for him and told him to issue an order to set mines in all the naval ships in the Baltic Fleet. And in an emergency, he was ordered to sink them. Kuznetsov did not want to make such an order. Only you, Comrade Stalin, can issue that order. The order was carried out, and the entire fleet was mined and could have been blown up upon a single command. In the same manner, all important buildings were also mined. The deputy to the National Commissar of Domestic Security, Merkelov, arrived early September and oversaw the placement of the explosives, should the city be overtaken by the enemy. The operation caused great commotion, raising fears that the entire city could explode at any moment. But these fears were unfounded, since there weren't enough explosives available, even though the order came directly from Stalin. 144 critical items of the city were mined and ready to blow by September 1941. Bridges, railway tracks, the largest factories, and everything that could represent a strategic advantage was wired to explode.
In the beginning of September 1941, the Germans were poorly informed about Leningrad. Effective reconnaissance only began a few weeks later. They were very surprised to learn from their intelligence that Leningrad was still building and repairing tanks, that they were continuing to produce Katyusha rockets and a huge number of explosives. Even more surprising was that all of the combative weaponry was being prepared for transportation out of the city. Also that many of the factories, businesses, and public offices were still functioning. Construction work was continuing uninterrupted. The regime was still intact. It was one thing to send farmers and other unskilled peasants in to fight with the Red Army. They could have been forced to do so, but under these circumstances, to continue to produce high-tech products for the military, like tanks and rockets, it required much more. The Germans knew that. These people must have had a great inner drive and dedication. Knowing this made the Nord Army unsettled and nervous. The commanders found it even fascinating.
I was 14 years old, and my father was a department head at the factory in Leningrad. He took me to the factory to work. I would be given a work card, and I would receive food credits. I worked in different departments. I worked on mine fuses, Katyusha rockets, and on many other devices. I was the youngest there. I didn't have an ID card, but I did my job just like an adult.
If necessary, we worked 3 shifts in a row, 36 hours non-stop. I went home and felt like the dead. When I woke up, I couldn't even remember where I was.
Throughout the factories were workers who could barely stand on their feet, but they kept working and even managed to exceed the production quotas.
The women on the second floor were unaware that they were putting together shells for Katyusha rockets. I had helped in the delivery to the military, so I knew that these were Katyusha shells. But my boss scolded me. Keep this to yourself. God forbid that you even say the word Katyusha in your sleep. That is how secretive this was all kept. Our Katyusha shells were used in the Stalingrad battle. We ourselves were living in a blockaded city, and we were providing Stalingrad with Katyusha shells.
The citizens of Leningrad suffered greatly from the hunger and the cold, but the city held together, and they kept on working. 148 types of weapons and ammunition were produced here.
At the Mikoyan factory, grenades were manufactured, but they also produced chocolate. They made chocolate specifically for the pilots. It provided them with extra energy and helped them fly under the difficult conditions. In the summer of 1941, our Leningrad pilots bombed Berlin for the first time. They were naval pilots of the Baltic Fleet and belonged to Preobrazhensky's regiment. It was well executed and the whole world wrote about it. Preobrazhensky recalled that they were flying above the sea and then made a strong vector direction Berlin. The city was still illuminated and they started bombing. The task was simple but highly symbolic. Reach Berlin and drop their bombs. The next day, Germany accused England of bombing Berlin. England made an official statement that none of its planes had flown the day before. Later, TASS released a statement that we were the ones who had bombed Berlin.
On an average, 245 shells and 175 air bombs fell on the city of Leningrad daily. The primary targets of the Luftwaffe was the military factories in the hope of destroying the Soviet weapon and artillery production.
Once there was a terrible bombing assault, and again 2 hours later. They were shelling us so heavily that we couldn't leave. We didn't even know where to find shelter, so we just kept on working. I was wounded. At first I didn't feel any pain and only saw the bleeding. Then I thought, oh my, I'm wounded. Vera Fyodorovna saved me, and thanks to her I'm alive now. An artery had been hit and I was bleeding badly. Blood was shooting out everywhere.
I helped her. Somehow we got the arm bandaged, and then I took her to the hospital. Oh, she suffered. There were lots of people suffering and in pain. One time, a dead person lay beneath me, and a wounded person on top of me, just like a sandwich. Then somebody helped us and led us to an air raid shelter. As the assault finally was over, we all crept out, still in a state of shock.
We repaired the tanks at the Kirov factory, and I cleaned valves. The supervisor would come by and test with his finger or a handkerchief and say, "Very good, that's enough, the next one." When there were air raid sirens, the factory's manager would chase us out. Go and find cover. I passed a bunker and I smelled something fried. I couldn't help but stop right there. There were two boys, about 14 or 15 years old, absolutely black with dirt. I said, "Boys, what are you doing here?" "Ah, it's a girl," I could hear them say. "I'm so hungry and my mother is dying," I said, and they helped me in. Inside was some sort of an oven with a baking tray on top filled with hot oil. They were frying small pieces of bread. I sighed in delight. The boys found an old can and filled it with these pieces of bread. They then gave it to me, saying, "We don't have anything else. Nothing." I went back home then with this can, and my mom exclaimed, "Where did you get fried bread?" I said, "Some boys invited me into their bunker." "And they gave you so much?" This literally saved us. Those guys had been black with dirt, but their souls were so kind, and they had hearts of gold.
I remember the blockade, especially when I'm sick. When I get feverish, then those images appear in my head again, like in a movie. I see how I went daily with my sled down the street to fetch some water, first to the passage, and then down to the Neva. At the Winter Palace, there was a spot to climb down to the water where the sailors had used explosives to break the ice. There were large ice holes there and people crowded in long lines. I couldn't lift a bucket that was full of water, so I filled it with a soup ladle. People yelled at me, "Hurry!" and pulled me away by the collar. I then joined the long line heading home down the Nevsky Prospect. Everywhere were buses and street trolleys covered with thick snow. The hardest day of my life was when I thought my mother was going to die. She couldn't get up since she suffered from edema and her entire body was swollen. I didn't know what to do since we had absolutely nothing to eat. Our friends who had left Leningrad left us a closet filled with books, which we burnt in the stove, one by one. We burnt everything we could to stay warm. The worst was when my mother, after great effort, had managed to get us both food cards, but they were stolen that very same day. She then turned to me and said, "Leonid, now we will die. I can't walk anymore. Take the last books and burn them. After that, I will then die." But behind the last books, I found a sack filled with lentils, about 2 kilos. God only knows how it got there. My mother, who had always been a staunch atheist, began to pray to God. At that very moment, God saved us, she said.
My father died on February 28th, and my mother on March 13th. When I came home, she was already dead. She was trying to get up from her bed, and one leg was lifted. She just stayed in that pose. I thought, my God, my mama is dead. It's over. She is dead. How will I bury her? We took a sled and wrapped her in a sheet. We then pulled her a very long way. At the Lermontov monument, there was a courtyard where people left the dead. An old man dressed in a sheepskin jacket asked, "Who are you carrying, girls?" We said, "Our mama." He said, "Well, unwrap her and put her in the first row." I said, "But she'll get cold." He said, "No, she won't. She's dead." He stood up and threw her to the others. We began to weep heavily and went home. I was now the last one left, an orphan.
The letters and diaries made public by insiders of the NKVD, the secret police, were deeply moving. December 1941, a 10-year-old boy wrote, "In the last 2 weeks, I've had nothing in my stomach except bread. Dad wants to eat the dead lying in the streets, but Mom is against it." There are diaries that end only after 3 pages. These are chronicles of the annihilation of entire families.
The first winter, 41-42, was the most terrible in the history of the Leningrad blockade. The temperatures reached minus 40 degrees centigrade, and in the houses there was no electricity, heating or running water. The food supply quota dropped to its lowest level. 250 gram bread for workers, 125 gram for children, otherwise nothing. This official document dated the 25th of December 1941 from the NKVD reads, "Top secret. Due to the lack of food supplies, mortality in Leningrad has increased steadily. Within the period of the 1st till the 10th of December 1941, 9,541 deaths were recorded. Within the period of the 11th till the 20th of December 1941, 18,447 deaths recorded. The total up until the 25th of December was 39,073 deaths. These are numbers from the Secret Service, but they are gravely understated. In reality, during the first winter of the blockade, approximately 2,000 people died daily."
The question, who is to blame, is a traditional Russian dilemma. In a report from the NKVD, dated February 1942, there is note of widely spread rumors of the arrest of Popkov and other representatives who were to blame for the mass starvation. It was an indirect way to denounce the Leningrad authorities. Popkov was the symbol of political power in the city. His arrest would have meant the disempowerment of the leading Leningrad authorities. So the NKVD wrote that the rumors of Popkov's arrest and of other heads of the Leningrad Managing Committee were circulating all over the city. Everyone was talking about it. Popkov had promised in the newspaper The Leningrad Truth better food supplies several times and had failed to keep his promise. Now the public's patience was at an end. Rumors crept through the city, and that is a very good indicator of public sentiment. However, Popkov was not arrested. He remained in his position. But no one was arrested for spreading rumors, since they were everywhere to be heard. Interestingly, there was also no investigation to find the source of the rumors. Normally, in such cases, the authorities were known to undertake some drastic measures. But this was not so in Popkov's case.
While working on the history of the city during the period of the war, we consulted with the former head of Leningrad Health Department, Professor Fyodor Moshansky. Once he told me confidentially, "Young man, I will tell you something that should not be made public in my lifetime or under the present government, but it is an historical fact." Then he said the Leningrad City Committee had published a report on the number of fatalities due to assaults and bombings, over 16,000. But in it, there was no word mentioned about the victims of starvation. Zatanov invited us chairmen to a meeting and asked us to establish a special commission to find out the real number of people who had perished due to starvation. This means even in the years of 1944 and 1945, no one knew the real numbers. How should they have kept accurate count in such a time of mass mortality? The professor continued. We issued the report as requested. It must be somewhere. Most likely it was held as classified. But even today, nobody has found it. It could possibly become the biggest secret to be buried with our generation.
The exact number of the blockade victims still remains unknown today. At least 800,000 civilians died of starvation, frost, assaults and bombings. The military losses in this siege on Leningrad should also not be forgotten. 980,000 deaths and almost 2 million injured and wounded.
The Germans' plans for Moscow and Leningrad were simple. Total destruction. Mowed down to the ground. These were Hitler's own words. No paraphrasing by historians after the war. To destroy such a city using bombs and shells was unrealistic. But the German specialists had reasoned. This is a European city, which means European architects built the buildings of stone and the floorings and ceilings are made of wood. So the aim was to burn the city down, as Rotterdam and Warsaw were burnt. But our city did not burn. And why? In the city was the Nevsky superphosphate factory. There, tons of superphosphate, a fertilizer, was produced for the entire country. The chemists came to a conclusion that the phosphate compound was fire-resistant, and it could be used to protect the city against the fire. So they developed a cream-like coating from this chemical. 2 small wooden houses were built for the test. One was coated with the substance. Explosives were detonated in each house. One house burned, but the other didn't. 2 more bombs were put in the coated house, but it still didn't burn. That same night, they decided to coat all the attics and floorings of the city with this cream-like substance. Leningrad Truth published an article about the Germans' attempt to burn the city, but the city seemed completely fire-resistant, as if made of steel.
On February 7th, the first train from the continent entered Leningrad after the 17-month interruption. Chairman of Leningrad's executive committee, Comrade Papkov, greeted the railroad men from Volkhov.
Comrades of Leningrad, the heroic Red Army has broken the blockade. Soldiers and workers have built new railroad tracks through the freed territory. And today, the railroad men from Volkhov have brought the first train from the continent to you.
On this very day, the first train left Leningrad and headed to the center of the country.
On the very first day of the offensive, everything became clear. We realized that something was going on. First, all the military troops moving around the city were hard to miss. Then, an unimaginably loud noise was heard. Some people even glanced back looking for evidence of enemy shells that might have fallen. But these were our shells, artillery preparation for our operation.
On January 14th, 1944, the Soviet freedom operation began in Leningrad. The initial artillery offensive lasted almost 2 hours. Heavy fire came from the Kronstadt stronghold and from the Baltic Navy ships as well as the field artillery. About 110,000 shells hailed down on the enemy. Then the tanks and infantry started their offensive assisted by air support. This was the beginning of the Neva II offensive operation to release the city from the blockade.
On the evening of January 27th, there was a radio announcement repeated over and over. Important news, important news. Comrades, soon important news will be broadcasted over radio. So on this evening, we heard the most wonderful news. The blockade was over. After hearing the news, I accidentally broke the only mirror we had. My younger brother and I had decided to carry out our own gun salute, either with the hammer or the empty tin can. I missed the target and hit the mirror instead. When our mother came home after work, she found us crying instead of being happy, because we had broken the only mirror we had. She began to kiss us and said, "Oh boys, what does the mirror mean in comparison to what has happened today?" The announcement from January 27th was unusual, since the news about the victory was broadcasted from Leningrad and not from Moscow. Some historians believe that Stalin did not value the city much and wanted to humiliate Leningrad. But this makes no sense. The victory news and the fireworks came from Leningrad and not from the capital, Moscow.
That was something. I was amazed and surprised. It gave me the impression that every house was shooting. I still have that amazing feeling inside. I don't know how to explain. Of course, the bread quota rose immediately.
It was overwhelming. There was light in the streets. It seemed unusually bright to us. I came back home and I was so happy that I didn't even know what to do. So many tears of joy. Many people were out on the streets. Then people started to come back to Leningrad. They were allowed to enter the city again, with the blockades finally being over.
It was such joy. We just kissed everyone that we met on the streets. Such happiness. It's impossible to put in words.
Tears of joy and tears of victory. The blockade of the city that lasted for over 900 days was fully broken. More than 1 million of Leningrad residents didn't live to see this happy day. They lie in mass graves in the cemeteries of Leningrad. More than 500,000 civilians were buried at the famous Piskaryovska cemetery. The residents of Leningrad had not only defended their city, they had also shielded the entire country. the attack on the Ukraine in the south and the relocation of tanks to the Leningrad front.
The Germans overran almost entire Europe while remaining on schedule. Only on the White Russian border did they run into difficulties. We kept them busy much longer than they had anticipated. As a result, Hitler transferred the center unit tanks to the Nord troops. Once Leningrad fell, they would then head to Moscow. The center unit commander demanded the tanks back from Hitler. He needed them to capture Moscow. But von Lieb needed those tanks for the offensive against Leningrad. And yet the city still would not surrender. The September days were devastating.
Hitler considered the capture of Leningrad to be one of the major goals of the war. He specifically declared this on December 18, 1940, in Directive Number 21 of the Barbarossa Plan. First, Leningrad must fall, then the attack on Moscow can begin. As Hitler was advised to let the German army bomb Leningrad in early September, he announced that the city would soon capitulate. German troops managed by the end of August to cut off the last remaining railway connection with the city. The German soldiers could already feel victory in the air. The city was so close. But Hitler suddenly ordered to stop the offensive. Instead, Hitler ordered a blockade around the city. The citizens of Leningrad should be cut off from communication with the outside world, and no food or other supplies were allowed to enter the city. No attempt to infiltrate the blockade was allowed. Millions of people trapped in the city were sentenced to a slow and brutal death by starvation.
In the beginning of the war, Leningrad was one of Hitler's primary targets. One can see this clearly from his own words. Only after Leningrad's capitulation would the German troops head to Moscow. Leningrad was strategically important, and everyone knew it. That's why the city had to be destroyed.
While visiting the Nord troops on June the 21st, 1940, shortly before the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler proclaimed Leningrad's conquer to be objective number one. Moscow was, in comparison, of much lesser importance. In late August, Hitler again ignored the advice of the head office, who favored targeting the main assault at Moscow. Instead, he proceeded with
Leningrad, ein Eckpfeiler der Sowjets an der Nordfront, ist nun von allen Seiten eingeschlossen. Deutsche Kampfflugzeuge greifen die bolschewistischen Stellungen an.
Footage from a German newsreel, the Deutsche Wochenschau, 1941. The German offensive against Leningrad. The Wehrmacht troops possessed superior military equipment and kept approaching closer and closer to the city. On August the 21st, the German army was only 20 kilometers away from Leningrad. September 4th. 2.5 months after the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, German shells exploded in the streets of the city.
The city awaited anxiously the deciding main assault. Everyone was given a job.
The enemy is very close, comrades. We may meet the enemy face to face. Therefore, comrades, let us take charge of our victory and work hard. Let us move toward our victory together with the Red Army, led by Lenin's party, and Stalin. Let's move to our victory, comrades. German occupants must die.
One of the still unknown aspects of the Leningrad blockade is the perplexing relationship between the Leningrad Party organization and the advisors to the Kremlin in Smolny.
Stalin recognized that the resources which Leningrad possessed were not being optimally used on the front. In many conversations, he emphasized that Leningrad had new tanks and up-to-date weapons. Why then, asked Stalin, did they fail to conquer one city after another? Why